Hey everybody, this is Jimmy Humphrey with jimmystable.com. I'm your host, Jimmy Humphrey, where I like to have conversations about faith, life, culture, and sometimes food. Today, we're going to talk about slavery. Yeehaw, right? Well, I thought I'd bring it up because, frankly, this past week I've seen a lot of people on Twitter, actually last 2 weeks now, talking about and defending the notion that the Bible was okay with slavery. Well, I'm kind of here today to tell you, no. The Bible was never okay with slavery. Let's get that straight, okay? So you have some people, especially skeptics of the Bible, or people who like to slam the Bible and come out with this notion that the Bible was okay with slavery. That's not true. And likewise, you get some individuals who admire certain individuals in church history and think, I admire them and everybody else I know admires them and they defended slavery, so I can't come out and say slavery is okay, but I'm going to come out and say, maybe it was, not such a bad thing after all. Well, let me just tell you unequivocally, no, the Bible never, ever, ever, ever looks at slavery as a good thing, ever, okay? Let's get that clear. And really, you can see this notion that the Bible was never okay with slavery, really from the beginning. We see in Genesis that Noah cursed one of his sons and said, "You'll be a slave." Noah didn't consider that a good blessing there, was it? Then you also have some of the patriarchs. One of them had to work twice, 7 years each, as a slave to marry his wives. That's not a good thing. The Bible didn't think of that as a good thing, did it? No. And then some other Bible character, Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery by, some people he loved, and they allegedly were supposed to love him back, but they decided, we need to get rid of him. So they sold him into slavery, and the Bible didn't like that either. And then there were the Jews. The Jews, they lived in Egypt for 400 years as slaves to Pharaoh, and they cried out to God for deliverance. And guess what? God heard their cry and delivered them. So apparently, slavery wasn't a good thing for them either. So I think you're kind of getting my point here. Right from the opening chapters of the Bible, we see slavery is generally regarded, pretty bad. In fact, slavery was so bad that God decided to intervene on the behalf of the Hebrew people and decided to send 10 plagues on Egypt, killed a bunch of people, killed the firstborns of Egypt, set the Jews free, and generally had a bad taste in his mouth towards slavery. So, for all you out there, you skeptics or people who want to defend Jonathan Edwards or somebody else you really liked, thinking slavery was a good thing in the Bible, well, guess what? It wasn't. But what about all those laws, you might ask, that the law of Moses talks about regarding slavery? What do we do with those? And that's kind of a fair question. What do we do with those? Because there are definitely some verses in the law of Moses that seem to, kind of give a wink and a nod at slavery. Well, the truth of the matter is, the law of Moses kind of gave a wink and a nod to a lot of things that God hated. Jesus said God hates divorce, but, he allowed people to get divorced. And the Bible made laws about theft, and the Bible made laws about adultery and manslaughter and all sorts of things that the Bible regulated that God didn't instantly require everybody who participated in such activities to die a cruel death. So if you want to say that the Bible is okay with slavery, really what you're failing to realize is that the Bible is no more okay with slavery than any other government that has ever existed that has passed laws about how to regulate all sorts of things. I mean, there's even laws in the Bible about regulation of prostitution. If you really look closely, I'll let you go find that one. It'll drive you nuts, but you'll find it in there. So the Bible regulates all sorts of things that God ultimately condemns. It's kind of like God kind of makes some concessions and say, hey, I know you guys are going to be a bunch of idiots. I know you guys are going to do a bunch of dumb things, stupid things that harm each other. But I'm going to put some measure of control on this because I know in the hardness of your hearts, you're not going to make it go away. So I'm going to allow these things to happen because your hearts are so hard and wicked and stupid and bad, and you're going to do these things anyway, so, I might as well at least set up some laws governing those things. And in doing so, God is in no way putting his stamp of approval on slavery. But what about Paul? The Apostle Paul seemed to put some regulations out there in Ephesians and Colossians about how masters were to treat their slaves and how slaves were to behave towards their masters. That surely shows that the Apostle Paul approved of slavery, right? Well, I would say such is a misreading of the text. If you really think about what you're reading over there in Ephesians and Colossians when Paul talks about masters and slaves and how they're supposed to relate to one another through Christ, you would realize at the end of the day that Paul was actually teaching them how to be subversive to the relationship between master and slave. And that subversion would have ultimately undermined and cracked the very institutions that ultimately were supported by slavery. In Bible times, times of the Apostle Paul, it's estimated by some that roughly a third of the Roman Empire was enslaved, and that included many individuals in the life of the early church. So when you see Paul instructing people on how to handle slavery and master issues, well, he's ultimately showing them how to navigate some very difficult waters. In Paul's teachings, when he instructs slaves to basically just go the extra mile, kind of like Jesus taught people to go the extra mile. If somebody forces you to go 1 mile, go with them too, Jesus said. But the Apostle Paul also, if you read the text closely, instructs masters to grant their slaves justice. And what could justice mean except to, when it was in the power of the master to do so, to actually free that slave? Just as Paul instructed ultimately Philemon to release Onesimus. But you might still be kind of scratching your head on that one and think, well, if masters are gonna have to release the slaves, then how are they still masters? Why wouldn't Paul just say release the slaves? Well, that brings up another issue as well. During those days, not all the slaves in ancient Rome could be set free. In fact, there was a class of slaves that was ultimately only able to be set free by Caesar and the Senate. The only way that individuals could be set free was to be set free by the Senate or Caesar. Well, guess what? Most Christians weren't Caesar, and most Christians weren't the Senate. So, if you were in a position in society to govern slaves, even in ancient biblical times, if you would have been a low-ranking government official who was put in charge of the slaves, well, you would have had to treat those slaves fairly and justly, according to the Apostle Paul. That's what history and context is all about, people. That's why we study these things deeply. That's why I don't believe there's any sort of disagreement in Scripture whatsoever about the issue of slavery in either New or Old Testament. And finally, this just defies the basic ethical teachings of the Bible. Jesus said, treat others as you would have them to treat you. Nobody wants to be treated like a slave. Nobody volunteers to be a slave, or few people volunteer to be a slave. So if you don't want to be a slave, well, you probably shouldn't enslave other people, because people are created in the image of God. They were born free, just as they were in Genesis. And just as God didn't intend divorce in the beginning of creation, God didn't intend slavery in the beginning of creation either, did he? So slavery, always a bad thing from cover to cover in the Bible. All mankind is seen as created in the image of likeness of God, worthy of decency, humanity, respect, and to be loved, just as we even love God. So if you think the Bible somehow supports slavery in spite of the ethical teachings of Christ and the theology of Scripture, well, I think you're just reading kind of at the surface level. You need to go a little bit deeper. So everybody, this has been Jimmy Humphrey, jimmystable.com. Hope you've enjoyed this kind of sarcastic video on slavery because, well, frankly, I'm just so perplexed that anybody could possibly believe the Bible somehow is okay with slavery. So there you go. There's my response. No, the Bible is not okay with slavery.